Okay, so Module 2, we're really going to get into the thick of the core of the Python language. If you haven't already, go ahead and read through the module documentation up until part 1. So go ahead and just peruse through all this, and when it asks you to try something, go ahead and give it a try. And when you've done that, come back here and continue with the video. Okay, so before we get into this code, I'm just going to go over a little bit of about how this is organized and how to navigate it. So each of these parts corresponds to a Python file, a module in the course repository. And if you're looking at this documentation on your local machine after having built it, you should be able to hit this link here, the header for each of these sections. And it'll take you to the file that contains this code that we're going to talk about. So if I hit this, you'll see it opened up. We're in, go ahead and move this. We are in Learn Python Module 2 Basics lesson part 1 underscore none.py. And you'll notice that the documentation here is actually rendered right here. This table renders like this when we run sphinxdoc. And then we have the code listed verbatim with line numbers. So the other thing to know, so we're going to be bouncing back and forth between the HTML documentation and the VS Code here. So it's pretty easy to get from the HTML to the code, just follow the links. But to go the other way, you can have your web browser open and go back to it, but I'll just show you where the docs live on. So after you've built the docs, there will be a build directory that's grayed out here because we've configured Git to ignore it, so this won't accidentally get committed to a repository. So if you look in here in HTML, this index file is what we're after. So if you hit show in browser, it'll pull it up. Let's exit out of this. So the other way to do it is if we actually run our doc command. Let's say view, let's go terminal, new terminal. So we're in VS Code, and we can say poetry run doc. And if we don't give it anything, what it's going to do, like any subcommand or anything, well, so if you recall, we have a number of subcommands available to doc. So we can build, we can clean it, which actually just deletes this directory. But if going through here and right-clicking, opening the docs is too much work, you can just run the doc command without any subcommands, and it will open the docs in your browser. So one other thing to note here, let's see, let's exit out of this terminal, start a new one. So you'll notice that when we started terminal, VS Code did something for us. It sourced, which means it ran a script that is located here. Now you notice that we are currently in this directory right here. So it sourced something that is in .vnv bin activate. It sourced this script. What does this script do? Well, so when we did poetry install, one of the things poetry did is it created this .vnv directory, and this is where our Python virtual environment was installed. Now, when you source the activate script in a Python virtual environment's bin directory, that activates the virtual environment. That means that when you run Python or any Python related thing, it is going to use this virtual environment. And you'll notice when this terminal first started, this was our command prompt. Then VS Code ran source this script, and now we have it's prefixed with this learn Python. This is the name of the virtual environment, and this is just a visual cue to you to let you know that this environment has been activated. Why am I bothering with this? Well, in all the documentation instructions, every time we run a course command, I'm telling you to say poetry run, doc, or poetry run, whatever. Well, what poetry run is doing is it is essentially doing this source. So it is sourcing this activate script. So poetry run is just saying, run this next command within our Python virtual environment. But since VS Code, when we launched our terminal, it was smart enough to just automatically activate this virtual environment for us, we don't actually have to prefix all our commands with poetry. So if you get tired of doing that and you're using VS Code and it's sourced the virtual environment correctly, you can just say doc. Just as a way of illustrating how virtual environments work, anytime you've activated a virtual environment, you can deactivate it just by typing deactivate. Now you'll notice that the prefix here went away. Our Python virtual environment is no longer activated. So if I just type doc now, it's going to say, oh, this command doesn't exist, and that's because it's not searching for it in the virtual environment or finding it. So if I ran poetry run doc here, this would work. Okay, let's go ahead and look at part 1 here. So, the way these lesson Python scripts are organized is, let's go ahead and look at the next one. You'll notice that this imports everything from the one before it. So each of these lessons imports the one before it. And we have a script called module2 that we have defined here, and you'll notice that it imports the last lesson. And so if we run poetry run module2, it is going to execute each of these Python modules in order, and nothing should happen. And the reason nothing happens is because the only code that is doing anything in any of these lessons is asserting or assert statements. And all of these assertion statements should evaluate to true. And when an assert statement evaluates to true, nothing happens. Now, if an assert statement evaluates to false, so if I said assert false, false is not true, and I ran these modules, you will see that I get an assertion error, and the string that I wrote here is passed out. So the reason we're using assertion statements here is I am illustrating how the language is working. So if we look at empty here, so this is a variable in Python. Remember, whenever we do name equals something, we are assigning whatever is on this side to a memory, some address in memory, and we're going to be able to refer to that address using the word empty. Now in Python, all languages have a concept of the absence of a value. And in Python, this is called none. In most languages, they actually refer to this as null. So if you see null somewhere on the internet, in Python, it's the same thing as none. It's just a way, it's a convention that we have to say, oh, this variable doesn't actually have a value conceptually. Now, I mean, in memory, this actually resolves to something. It's just something that means nothing. And so frequently in Python, you'll be comparing values, and to check if a variable is none, the convention is to use this keyword is. So when we say empty is none here, this is going to evaluate to true. Now, any of these operators will work on variables that hold the none value. And you'll notice that these equality operators and not equal operators also work. The convention, and we'll get into why later, but the convention is to use this keyword is instead of equals equals when we're comparing something directly to none. And this is different than what we'll do when we compare other data types. You'll notice that down here, if you add an expression to an if clause, it will implicitly convert that expression to a true false value. So none resolves to false. And so if we say if none, this will never happen. It is impossible for this assert statement to execute because this will always evaluate to false, and this will never trigger. And you can see that our VS Code is actually smart enough to know that because it has this kind of grayed out here, which is a visual indicator that like this code isn't actually going to be executed ever. So the last thing I want to cover on this first page is you'll notice I have this import statement up here, import IPDB. This is just so that as you're going through these lessons and bouncing back and forth, that it's easy for you to just jump in the debugger. So if at any point you want to halt execution at a line and launch into the interactive Python debugger and play around with variables, all you have to do is say ipdb.setTrace, and now we're going to run the module, and you'll see, ooh, a breakpoint has triggered, and now this is essentially the interactive Python terminal, but I am at this point in the code. So all of these statements have executed. So empty should be accessible here. It should be defined. So if I say empty, it prints nothing is returned because this is nothing. But if I said, oh, let's see what type empty is, and we'll go over type later, but just to show you that this does in fact exist, it's a none type. Now, only variables that I have defined are going to mean anything here. So if I just said other, it's going to say name area. Other is not defined. That's because we have not defined other as a variable. But if I said other none, other is now defined. I can say other is none, and that evaluates to true. I can say other equals none. Also true. I can say other equals empty. Also true because they are both none. Now, what is going to happen if I do this? That also evaluates to true. And we'll talk about the differences between is and equals later. But for now, just understand that if you're going to compare a variable directly to none, it is by convention, it's better to use is than equal.